When you create these kind of simulations, the thing that you're looking for is emergence. You want things to come out of the simulation that you hadn't explicitly programmed. And when I started developing Noble Ape, there were so many different things that could emerge from the simulation. And there were a few early on, but one of my favorites that I like talking about is through Bob Mottram's work. Because Bob Mottram created this notion that the apes not only had internal simulations, but they had internal actors that had internal simulations. A bit like, sometimes you might think about a thing in the future where you have participants in the future and you try to think about how those people are going to react to things that you say and stuff like that. You kind of play things out in your head, basically. And Bob Mottram added this characteristic within the Noble Ape simulation, that the Noble Apes had representations of themselves as actors and also other entities that would interact with them as a means of, I guess, constructing a coherent society, particularly when they were away from certain people, or if Noble Apes died, right? Or, in case of death and these kind of things, you end up with a kind of deity-like Noble Ape, potentially, in some circumstance, where the Noble Ape has died long ago, but a series of Noble Apes have this Noble Ape as an actor in their existing, cognitive simulation. So one of the things that came out of this that was really interesting was the notion of an epic score. And what the epic score was, that within the community of Noble Apes, there would be apes that would be talked about more, because obviously when the apes interacted with one another, they also spoke. And there was an interesting notion that the internal narrative translated to an external narrative through speech. And once you have an internal narrative with a lot of actors, you have an ability for people to talk about people in not necessarily like identical factual terms, but associated with the way people think they're going to say, or what they think they're going to do, or this kind of behavior. And through this, you have this notion of an epic score, which is within the community of Noble Apes, which are the apes that are talked about the most. And this phenomena came to a head associated with this notion of false parentage. So the apes, when they're born, they obviously develop, certain bonding, certain connections with parents that are associated with raising, initial nurturing, feeding, this kind of stuff. And they develop notions of parenting around the apes that are around them early on in their development. Now, it can happen that a mother or father ape can be killed and another ape can take up that parenting role, and the ape that grows up is raised thinking that the other ape is their parent. So there's the whole notion that it's possible, actually, for there to be false parents. So the epic scores that were found, and this is an emergent property, this was not explicitly programmed, but the epic scores that were found particularly high could be traced back to gossip, that these apes had different parents than they thought they had. And there's a mutation component to communication anyway, but if the communication was mutated where the discussion associated with an individual ape was that they had different parents, or that one of their parents was different, or these kind of things, immediately they shot up the epic graph. And it was just like this really crazy emergent property where you're trying to debug this thing and you're just like, the reason that this thing is there is because like the shared thing among these apes that shoot up the epic graph. And here I'm talking about tens of different simulations that are run independently with no shared apes between them. But you can see the apes that go up the epic score highly are the ones that have this kind of gossip spread about them. It's a very interesting metric to calculate in this kind of communication, because when I approached academics with this thing, I talked about this initially at a conference, Artificial Life Conference in 2012. I talked to an academic about this, a particular academic. He said, you've got to do all these things before you can prove this is happening. I'm like, just debugging a simulation, I can prove it's happening through debugging a simulation, right? So there are different margins here. This may be why academic artificial life has only gone so far, whereas, Noble Ape has gone so far further. Because at the end of the day, I have historically published academically. And the whole thing associated with academia is funny, because you say, you need these really high standards for publication. A lot of times you don't even see software with publication. A lot of times they kind of describe what they do and then they show the results, and there's no correlation. I mean, sometimes bugs, it could be a bug. In this case, it wasn't, because I debugged it very heavily, and it was actually a byproduct of the simulation. But sometimes bugs can be the whole thing. And I worked with a fellow for his PhD. I'm not going to name any names, but I worked with a fellow for his PhD, and the bugs seemed to be actually a good portion of the simulation. I gave them this feedback. It was kind of taken on board. But you find that when you do this stuff independently, there are always going to be naysayers. There are always going to be people that say, yeah, whatever. Doesn't stop me. But I was thinking about some of the best examples of emergence, and that was one of my favorites. There are a few others, actually. And no doubt through these video recordings, I'll discuss another emergent property or two. No doubt.